Hello and welcome to our general installation help video for installing RackForms on Windows when talking to IIS and using MySQL as your database server. It's important to note as we go through this video that every system and setup that you may run across will have understandable differences. So newer versions of Windows versus older, MySQL installer as we're about to see, different versions of IIS. The trick usually with this process is not so much the actual process of doing it. It's more just accounting for the various version differences that we might run into. And so we're going to try to count for most of those that we can here, but please note that as time goes on, this video will change in terms of its intent and how you interpret the instructions. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to bounce in my Windows installation. I've got a Firefox browser open right now, and I'm just going to do a really quick search for MySQL. Our first step, of course, is actually grabbing the database server. When we actually do so, usually I just follow the MySQL downloads link. Again, as everything in this video is, there's going to be big changes in this, obviously, moving forward. Generally speaking, you want to find the MySQL Community Edition. From there, you're going to find the Community Server. From Community Server, you're going to scroll down to the MySQL installer for your particular version. In this case, again, we're doing Windows, so I click on this. This then takes me to this page right here, and then you can download either the sort of offline version right here, where it's going to download all the packages, or it'll download the online version right here. And so both of these, note, as far as the installer goes, are x86 32-bit. So once we have that, we're going to find the file in our standard downloads folder. And if I go to my downloads, I should see hopefully the MySQL installer item. There it is right here. So I'll just double click on this and begin the install process. Now I'm probably going to pause the video at certain points throughout the setup process here, because I certainly don't want to bore you to tears with the process of waiting for an installer to do what it is going to do. But generally speaking, MySQL, there's really two components that we're interested in getting here. The first is the MySQL server itself. This is where our database is going to live. And then the second is the MySQL workbench, which allows us to actually set up our initial database and do things like create accounts, which will be, of course, useful for the RackForms installation process. So I'm going to say yes to both of those security warnings. The installer is going to fire up. We're going to get a basic license. Go ahead and accept that. And then I'm going to have to come to my first decision. Now, this setup that we're doing here is for development machines. We are not at all doing any recommendations for production servers here. For that, you'd want to consult a professional or hire a consultant for that type of work. In this case, we're doing things very security simple, which is to say we're just using basic passwords and only running our server, in this case, on a virtual machine in a protected environment. So because that's the case, I'm just going to leave it as the default for default developer. So go ahead and accept that. It looks like there's a few requirements that we have here. In this case, it looks for the connector for Python. It wants to possibly install an optional extra. I'm not actually using Python, so I'm going to skip that and just say yes to the warning there, because again, we're using PHP for our RackForms installation. So we have a bunch of things that it's asking us to install right here. So in this particular case, there's a lot of stuff that I may not want. And so just to kind of show you the difference here, we can also back up and just do a custom install. And the custom install is interesting because now we're just going to get a range of products that we could potentially install using the manual list right here. And honestly, this is the one I usually use because really all I need is just the MySQL server. So in this case, this guy right here, and then under applications, the MySQL workbench, which again is our management tool, so we can create various set various properties about our database. Again, there's a few other things that we might be interested in: MySQL, shell, router. All those we don't care about for a basic installation. Again, really the two things that we care about are the server and the workbench. But if you're interested in doing additional development work, certainly take a look at some of those. For us though, this is good. I'm just going to hit next, and I'm going to hit execute under the installation step. Now, generally speaking, when this process completes, it's going to ask us to set up the general environment for our MySQL server. And really the important thing that we're doing there is defining the root user account. And in our case, we're going to do an optional step of creating a RackForms user right away as well. The general idea when you have MySQL is it has a root account that is sort of like the administrator account for the machine, and then we usually connect to MySQL through essentially client accounts, basically anything other than root. And that's always a good habit to get into. We could certainly install RackForms to connect to the root account, but there's, even on a developed machine, very little incentive, I think, to be that careless about security. Even if nobody's ever going to touch this machine, to use like a root account, especially on a database server, is just, there's really no reason for it, because it's not going to be applicable anywhere else that you run software if you have sort of like a real setup at some point. So in our particular case here, as we get into the actual configuration of this, you're going to notice that we're going to configure MySQL in terms of root account, but then we're also going to you make sure to use RackForms with an actual specific account. Before we get to that though, in this particular case, we're not using a cluster, it's just a standalone MySQL server. It is also going to ask us here about the setup that we have. So the defaults are usually okay here. There's various things like name pipes and shared memory, which we can use for faster connections. In our particular case, we don't actually care about those. So I'm just going to hit next, and then we're going to get to our next big item here. So it turns out that in the newest versions of MySQL, there is a new SSL security standard that is supported in RackForms, but honestly, especially for development environment, a lot more work than it's worth. And so we're going to be choosing the use legacy authentication method because this is actually going to maintain backwards compatibility. If you use this version right here, this would be nice to use, especially in production environments. It's going to essentially require SSL connectivity. Again, RackForms supports that, but especially for a development environment, it's overkill. So for our purposes here, we're going to use the legacy authentication method. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a MySQL root password. Again, this is a test machine, so guess what? I'm using the word test. There is absolutely nothing crazy I'm going to do here. Just going to put in that very basic password, and then I'm going to also add a user. And the user in this case is going to be the RackForms user that we're eventually going to create. Its host is going to be localhost, it's going to be a DB admin, and a password is going to be test and test. So very, very simple here. The root user and the new user creating right here is just going to be test for all the passwords. Then I'm going to hit next. I'm going to, again, keep the defaults right here. I'm going to start MySQL on startup, and it's going to be configured as a Windows service. So I'm just going to click next. So if you're kind of following along right here, really the name of the game here, besides changing the connection type, is really just all defaults. So there's nothing crazy that's going on here. Again, at least in this version of the MySQL installer, we're just using all the default values for our setup here. So when that's done, I'm going to go ahead and click finish, and then I'm going to hit next. And then we're going to fire up MySQL Workbench as that last little checkbox stated. So what does this actually mean? Well, MySQL Workbench is a nice little program that, as mentioned before, allows us to do things with our configuration. And so because that is such a big part of working with RackForms is having a database, we obviously want to make sure this is set up properly. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to connect to my MySQL instance, and I'm going to do that by just double clicking on this icon right here. This, you'll notice, is my root account. And this is going to connect. It's going to ask for a password. I'm going to say test, and then I'm going to save that password to the vault. That way when I launch this program, I don't have to keep logging in. And again, this is all because it's a local development environment. I'm going to take this SQL additions thing. I'm going to scoot this down. I don't really need that. What I'm really interested in here is creating a new schema and then assigning a user to that. So you notice here I've clicked over to schemas, and then I'm going to add where this little click little schema button is. I'm going to click this, and I'm going to call the schema RackForms, and I'm going to hit apply. And this is just going to create a schema called RackForms for me. I'm going to finish that, and then finally I'm going to go into the administration section right here. I'm going to go into users and privileges. I'm going to select that RackForms user that we created during the installation process, and I'm going to go ahead and assign a schema privilege to this user. In other words, a schema is different from a user. So we're using the same name for our schema and our user, but it is important to note here, the RackForms as a user, even though it's the same name as the schema that we have, doesn't necessarily mean that it obviously has permissions to that schema. So we have to do that specifically. We have to say RackForms as a user is going to get an entry added for a selected schema, in this case the schema called RackForms. So I hit add entry, I selected the schema, and I'm going to hit OK. Then it's going to ask me what rights I want for this. In this case, I'm going to select all, and I'm going to hit apply. And then what this is going to do is this going to essentially apply those rights to the RackForms user. So at this point then, I should have a schema that's called RackForms that has a user that has access to it. So for now, I'm going to go ahead and shrink this down, and I'm going to go from my downloads folder here into my www root folder. So we actually have other videos that talk about the installation of RackForms, and I'm going to refer you to those for the actual specifics on setting up IIS. I'm just going to quickly go over my setup here just to make sure that you have kind of like the basics down. But we do have specific videos in terms of setting up IIS. Really, this video is, again, just kind of focusing on the MySQL aspect of this. But in general, it goes something like this. So I have in my C drive a folder called inetpub www root. It is important, of course, to notice, and so I'm just going to go into my add and remove programs. It is important to actually have IIS running on your machine. And the way that we do that has changed somewhat in the newer versions of Windows. But basically, I'm going to go to add remove programs. I'm going to say manage optional extras. And then I'm going to, let's see here, actually not history. I'm actually going to go into, let's see here, programs and features. That's what I want to do. We want to turn Windows features on or off. This has changed. It's actually good somewhat that I bounced around there for a second. Unfortunately, there's two ways in newest versions of Windows to handle settings. There's like the old version, and then there's these new looking screens right here. And unfortunately, you can't do everything that you need to with these new versions of the settings screens. And this is a good example. If I want to add Windows features, I need to go programs and features, and then go into this specific screen, and then followed by turn Windows features on or off. When I turn Windows features on and off, what I'm basically doing is I'm installing the Internet Information Services. And there's a couple things that I want to grab in here. So under Web Management Tools, I want to grab the IIS Management Console. It's not always required, but I like to have that just in case. You need to do command line features. Really where the bulk of we're putting items in is in the World Wide Web Services. Under Application Development Features, I put in ASP.NET 4.7. Again, not really needed for RackForms, so we can actually create C# forms. So I'm just kind of putting that in there just for fun. I'm going to then make sure that I check CGI, ISAPI, and ISAPI filters. So basically these four guys in addition to .NET extensibility. Under Common HTTP features, I'm going to check these guys right here. Go ahead and just pause the video, and if you want to kind of match my setup, do that. HTTP logging. Under performance features, static content compression, and then finally under security, I'm just going to put on request filtering right here. And so that is my basic setup. And when I do that, then it's going to ask you to confirm that. And once you have that, you should have the same basic setting that I do now, which is to say you should now have the ability to launch IIS Manager. Basically, go to your start menu and type in IIS, and you'll get this program right here. Again, not a full-featured version. Probably install IIS in PHP, but again, the long story short version is you want to use a web platform installer. Go ahead and download that from Microsoft if you don't already have it. Launch it from within IIS and do a search for PHP 7.2. And then when you have PHP 7.2 selected, as we'll do right here, or I should say as a search, you'll notice that there are several different versions of PHP that we can have. The one that we're interested in is going to be PHP 7.2 using that x64. And then just for the sake of completeness, in case you change databases at some point, go ahead and grab the Microsoft Drivers 5.3 x64 for PHP 7.2. Again, keep in mind that as time goes on, this will be a different version of PHP. Probably 7.3 in a year from now, and so on and so forth. So just grab the newest version that you can find of PHP, in this case 7.2, and make sure you grab those Microsoft drivers as well. Once you do that, it's going to go ahead and install PHP, and then optionally we're going to grab the PHP Manager download from RackForms.com. We actually have that in this location right here, RackForms.com, documentation, RackForms install guide, and then under that installing RackForms on Windows and IIS, basically this guy right here, download this MSI and run it, and then that will actually put onto your machine this PHP Manager console right here. Once you have that, go ahead and double click on PHP Manager. You may get a warning up here about a non-optimal configuration. Make sure you set it so it is the optimal configuration, and then just make sure that these locations, program files, PHP 7.2, just make sure that these actually bring up valid files, right? So you actually have a valid setting. This manager then is where you'll come for all of your PHP related tasks, adding and removing extensions, checking error logs, configuring runtime limits, etc. Lots and lots of good stuff here. And this is where we'll, again, manage our PHP installation. With that done, we do want to create a site for RackForms. So usually we'll right click and we'll say add website. It's going to ask us for some basic configuration. It's going to ask us for example, site name. I usually just type in RackForms. It'll ask us for a physical path. We'll actually just go to that C inet pub folder that we talked about before. You'll extract RackForms and put it into a folder called usually RackForms. Then all the files that go into that will be located there. And then usually you'll have a host name, of course, and so your host name is going to be what you're going to call this site, and this is what it's going to respond to when you type the address in the URL bar. There are a couple of restrictions in RackForms. You can't call your site pro anymore. Unfortunately, Google bought the pro domain, or excuse me, dev, so you can't call it dev because it won't map to anything on most browsers anymore, and you can't call it localhost because that's too generic, but basically anything else from IP addresses to host names is fine. And to actually learn more about that process, you're going to want to head on over to the installation documentation for localhost installation guide, and this will actually tell you how you actually set it up so that you have a host file that actually maps to your website. With all that done, then the site should be started and ready to serve HTTP files, and in this case that's what we should hopefully have. And actually, there it is, where did my site go? It's right here. So RackForms is hosted under Pro right here. So this then takes us to the installation process. So I actually have on this machine SQL Server, which I'm usually running RackForms as. And so this is actually an already running version of RackForms. But just for the sake of demonstration, I'm just going to go ahead and set up RackForms as if this was a default or standard installation. And to do that, I had my install file renamed so it wouldn't get loaded when I first ran the site. But in this case, I'm going to actually rename it. So just install.php. The effect of this then is when I try to load my RackForms installation, or essentially go to that site that we've configured, it's going to go directly to the install screen. At this point then, it's really just up to us to actually configure RackForms so it actually uses our MySQL server. So it just turns out that the default database vendor is in fact MySQL, and so we're actually going to leave this as the default. For database name, we're going to type in the value that we had set before. In this case, it's both RackForms for the database name and for the username. Of course, my database password is test, and my host, this is important, is just going to be localhost. Right? My MySQL server is running on the same machine that my web server is, so I'm just going to use localhost right here. Then I'll actually go in and I'll configure my RackForms login, so in this case it's Matt and Test, and then I'll put in my email right there. I'll set up my server time zone. In this case, the default is correct right here, and then it's also putting my domain name right here, which you'll notice is pro. So at this point then, I'm all ready to go. I'm just going to go ahead and hit install, and the RackForms is going to go in and it's going to write my database tables and configure my files. That actually takes us to one real quick thing about permissions. I'm going to talk about that in just a second, but before I do, let's just bounce into the MySQL Workbench right here, and let's just refresh this. And now we can see under tables, we have all the tables that go into a RackForms installation. I kind of like doing this because this lets me know that after I've run the installer, yeah, the installer told me that the installation was complete. If we had errors, we would know, but it's actually nice sometimes just to kind of verify that, yeah, sure enough, here's all the tables that go into a RackForms installation. At this point then, we want to go in and we want to rename our install file. So I'm just going to change this back to install.php.old. Yes, I want to change the name. And then I'm going to really quickly talk, before we test our installation, I'm going to really quickly talk about file permissions. So again, this is one of the things that is actually, and somewhat unfortunately, especially in the Windows world, a little bit more complicated than I would like it. But basically, when we run a website, specifically a PHP website, as we're doing right here through IIS, we do need to make sure that the folder that we're trying to access through the site, in this case RackForms, has permissions with your user account on the machine so that when IIS tries to run or serve files from there, that it actually works. And there's actually a couple different ways that we can do that. So the first is we could set up the name of the IIS app pool to just have full control. I've done that here. I've also created IIS iUsers and given this guy full control. And then finally, users. So in other words, my user account for the machine as well as my actual machine account has full permissions as well. Unfortunately, I'm not an expert on Windows file permissions, so you may need to experiment a little bit about this, or better yet, actually far more recommended, just go online and actually look up information about running PHP safely on IIS servers. I actually don't run IIS and PHP in production at all. I always run it on Linux, and so again, I'm just unfortunately not an expert, but I do know that, again, the core idea that we're after here is IIS runs as an identity. You want to give that identity access to the RackForms folder itself so they can write files and write forms. At any rate, when we're done with that, then we're going to go ahead, click here to make sure we can test the installation. Again, my username is Matt and test. It's very simple, and I should hopefully see, if all goes well, then when I perform the actual login right here, it should actually go into my RackForms installation right here and actually run the editor. At this point, I'm using a brand new install, so there's literally no job saved. But if I actually create, let's say, a sample job right here and press save, not only should it actually build the job and display it as a web page to me, but as we'll see here shortly, I should be able to go into my database and actually confirm that my jobs are being saved. So again, if I bring up MySQL Workbench, I know, because we work with RackForms, that when we create a job, it's saved in the folder called, or the table called FB jobs. So sure enough, here's our job called sample, along with all of its job data. So just kind of doing some various checks to make sure that everything worked. So that's basically it. We obviously went a little bit fast because there's a lot of steps, but hopefully with this video format here, you'll be able to kind of pause as needed and go through the process. Again, the last and parting thing that I would say is once again, not to sound like a broken record, but to just note that as time goes on, as versions of the OS change and the installers change for the various tools that we had here, this video will start to diverge from the core process. That's why I'd like to instill the general idea that really what we're after here is not so much this video as the ultimate resource, but just this video as the building blocks, which is to say, if I want MySQL, just go ahead and download the MySQL installer and then check online documentation for how you get the database set up. Then the next building block is when we have a server like MySQL installed, that we know that we have two things. We have a schema that we're going to install to and a user that the schema is going to use. So I have my schemas, I have my administration. I know that I have a user called RackForms, which has access to the schema called RackForms. So again, these are all pieces of information you can learn a lot more online about MySQL database administration. Finally, of course, then, in our particular case, we're using IIS. So the idea of using and understanding the building block of installing PHP, using the various tools like Web Platform Installer, getting PHP Manager on there, administering your installation of IIS and PHP, and then understanding how we provide permissions to the various sites that we've created. So I'll leave it at that for now. Any questions, comments, as always, please let us know. Always happy to help.